UK poetry is a small world, so it's no surprise that some of the people I speak to for 3 poems and a question are my friends. And none more so than this time, because I'm talking to Jonathan Davidson. He's a very fine poet, whose poems are understated, calm, and they speak of a suburban England, a Midlands England, with railways and bicycles and orchards and simple brickwork featuring in them. In everything he writes, there's a sense of melancholy, but also a gentle underlying wit. It's tremendously English poetry, understated and yet large in its themes: family, mortality, how we can look after one another. His book on poetry and his latest book, Commonplace, both phrase a kind of life story through the poetry that he has read. And as you'll hear in this interview, he believes very much in the power of poetry as a thing that one should learn by heart and speak aloud, an embodied kind of poetry. You might also know Jonathan's name as the director of Writing West Midlands, the public writer development agency that does so much good work in mentoring, in developing and in creating opportunities for writers of all kinds across that region. So we sat down in a rather echoey space outside the Writing West Midlands office, where Jonathan had promised me that there would be hardly any sounds of slamming doors to interrupt us. He was, of course, completely wrong, but I promise you that the slamming doors do minimise as time goes on. Enjoy this conversation between a dedicated Northerner and a dedicated Midlander, and hear us clashing horns very gently occasionally. And I started by saying to this painfully modest man, was that introduction fair? Or was it cringe-making?
Well, of course it's cringe-making because one doesn't like to be described in public other than that person over there. But fair enough, I've done all of those things. You mentioned the Midlands, and I've lived in the Midlands for most of my adult life now, but I am reconnecting with what the Germans would call my Heimat, my homeland, which is the clay vales and chalk hills of the disputed border country of South Oxfordshire and North Berkshire, which changed their boundaries in 1974. So I moved from one county to another overnight. But actually, I mean, everywhere is the Midlands, really, in my view. You know, I haven't claimed on Oxford and also Manchester. They're just Midlands places.
No, they're not.
Who haven't, they just haven't looked themselves clearly in the mirror yet.
That's the North. You can't absorb the North. I would like to ask you, what are your 3 poems? Are they, for a start, all by you?
Of course not. That would be the kind of outrageous arrogance that put pay to Alexander the Great's ambitions. I know what happened to Mao Zedong and the cult of personality, and I've spent all of my life avoiding it. So you said to me 2 poems have to be by me.
I did say that. I said it because I knew that if I didn't say it, he would choose 3 poems by other people, and you would never get to hear his work at all.
It would be astonishing if other people's poems were not the most important poems in our lives. Because actually, other people are more important to us than ourselves, I hope. I mean, in my life, other people are more important than me. Not very many other people, but a small number of other people are more important than me. Of course, we live for others. When it comes to poetry, we are carriers. So I am always looking to the people who will carry the poetry into me, and I'm looking if I can release the poetry into another period of time in the future and so on. I think we have privileged the writer of poetry against a person who has an appreciation of poetry across a range of fronts. And at this point, I reference Johan Cruyff and the great Dutch football team of the 70s. And they had a concept called total football, which I think was that every aspect of football on the pitch was of importance, and not just the goal scorer, somebody hanging around in the penalty box to pop a goal in, but everybody was important. If you expand that in poetry, what I would argue is those who merely read other people's poetry or merely stare into this middle distance thinking about it, they are as necessary as those who write poetry, talking about it, thinking about it, reading other people's, buying other people's, organising, reviewing, all the multitude of things, many of which you've been involved in. Yeah. And I suspect you would agree with me, but those things don't get you any prizes. Yeah. And the writers of poetry, all of them as individuals will A, die, B, be forgotten. But the poems are what we want to continue, not the poets. The poets are just carriers of the poetry.
Yeah.
One of the essences of poetry, I think, is being able to communicate a lot in a little. And that's why it takes so long to write. And you will have heard this phrase, apology for my letter being so long, but I didn't have very long to write it.
Yeah.
Who is that quote from?
It's Sidney Smith. I'm sorry this letter was so long, but I had not the time to make it shorter.
Yeah, but actually, it's hard work to produce brevity. Brevity is important because life is short. We can only carry so many words in our minds and our hearts. If we want people to learn our poems by heart, we should certainly give them short poems. If we want them to have time to think about the poem, as well as just hear it, then we should give them short poems to give lots of space to thinking about it. And if we are involved in poetry not for the sound of our own voices, but for the happiness of others, then a short poem is to be approved of. But it takes a lot of discipline. So this poem by Charlotte Mew, shall I read it to you? I've never read it before. I used it in one of my out of office poems. In my out of office, which says I am not in my office, I also have for the last 2 years attached a poem. And it's from a book called the National Trust Book of Nature Poems, edited by Deborah Ulmer. It's called I So Liked Spring. I so liked spring last year because you were here. The thrushes too, because it was these you so liked to hear. I so liked you. This year's a different thing. I'll not think of you. But I like spring because it is simply spring, as the thrushes do. I should use a different word really, because it's more than nice. It's a beautiful little work of art which speaks a lot in very few words and is memorable. I could probably memorise that.
At this point I asked Jonathan to go back a little bit and talk again about the importance he gives to our participation in poetry, not just writing it, but reading it, consuming it, listening to other people's poetry.
The way poetry is offered to us in our country at the moment, and possibly in the Western world, is it's closely tied up with the publication of books and with the getting and spending of money and things which can be monetized, like poems that go in books, like competitions and so on. And as you know, I have some say extreme views, I would say entirely reasonable views about the danger of those systems which drive people to try and excel and kind of win the poetry world. Yeah. I suppose I compare it with those who wish to run around the country and those who are quite happy to just saunter around. And there are competitive walkers, aren't there? That is a thing. But generally speaking, walking is not considered competitive until some bloke gets out a book and says, we've got to go to all the highest possible hills. You think, oh, really, man?
100 walks you must do.
Yes, absolutely. There's no reason to say that. Why don't you just say, go out and have a nice walk? And if it takes you an hour to do 100 yards because you saw some interesting flowers, then that's absolutely fine. And with poetry, I think it's like that. If you write one good poem in your life, that's enough. I'm very keen on people enjoying taking other people's poetry through their bodies by reading it through their eyes and then speaking it through their voice boxes and then listening to it themselves and listening to other people speaking it. That side of it used to be really important, and now it is not important, to the point where you hear many people read poetry off the page and you realise they don't quite feel comfortable in reading it. They don't really realise that it's written to be read, and many poems are not written to be read in public. That's fine. They should have a note to say this is not to be spoken aloud. There's things you want to do, you can do on the page, you can't do if you read something out loud. But something out loud gives you something completely different if you take the poem through your body and release it in that way. And then even if it isn't, quotes, your poem, it becomes your poem because you have processed it and placed it in the silence as a speaker, which is an extraordinary thing to do. Musicians, they feel that, they understand that. They don't have to be Beethoven to enjoy playing the Moonlight Sonata.
Okay, then, I said, all this value that you attach to the aural experience of poetry and the oral experience of poetry, how does that affect the way that you write poetry?
Increasingly, it is slowing me down and almost stopping my tracks to kind of reconsider what I'm trying to make. When I started, I was trying to make things that on the page looked like other people's poems looked on the page, because that is how I was introduced to poetry. I've got evidence that I was listening to poems being read when I was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years old, and I would have liked. And lots of kids enjoyed hearing poetry read, nursery rhymes and regular poems. So I know that was back there. But then, of course, you go to school and you're taught that what you're trying to produce is what you can see on the page. So you must try and be like Keats or Thomas Hardy or Yeats at that time. Now it's a different range of poets. You're only encouraged to experience them via the written page, and your response is encouraged to be via another written page. You write something about that. When I describe that, you think, how utterly ludicrous. Who on earth thought that was a good idea? It will never catch on.
Quite often in my workshops, I will read people a poem and say, don't look at it. Don't look at it on the page. Listen to it and then tell me what you remember.
That is difficult for people. I've done that as well, and I see people twitchy at not having a piece of paper in front of them because they are approaching poetry as unseen comprehension, as they used to call it. Unseen comprehension is like so stupid. I feel I'm changing my style now because I'm realising that I was slavishly following the dictates of poetry as presented to me in the 1980s and 80s, 70s and 80s when I was at school, assuming that there was no alternative because I was told there's no alternative. I now realise there are many alternative ways of engaging with poetry, many different types of poetry, and that you don't even have to write it to be a poetry person. So I am writing things which are increasingly shorter. I'm experimenting with 4 to see whether those restrictions will make my work more memorable. I'm putting into my mind the idea of memorability. You very rarely hear people say, I want the poem to be memorable. And actually, when people come back from poetry readings I haven't been to, and they say, oh, it's fantastic, it's wonderful. I say, oh, great. Any good lines? Oh, no, I can't remember any lines at all. So because there were no images or rhymes or anything but lodged in the memory, what they remember is the sizzle, not the sausage. Now, I love a sizzle as much as I love a sausage. But the sausage of poetry is, is it genuinely, I think, is the language hewn so that it is overtly different from everyday language. Now, this is where I part company with 90% of the world who would like to write poetry that has the veneer of being, is demotic the right word? I think it is. Demos of the people. Everyday stuff. And I can see there's great cleverness in doing that and making a poem out of it. But equally, I want something now, increasingly as I get older, that has been carefully made and polished and chiselled and fashioned so that it cannot be mistaken for everyday language. So that it is a different register of language. Just as if I have a sculpture, I want that not to be bare rock. If you shape something, the light will reflect off it in interesting ways. It will glint and it will catch the light and it will look different and so on. Poetry, which is purely uses the demotic, it is in danger of not being memorable because our daily speech is not overtly memorable. Occasionally somebody will say a wonderful phrase.
I don't know, I dispute that. They fuck you up, your mum and dad.
I would argue that line was highly fashioned. He might have said that in passing, but he didn't just think, I'll write that down, that's the poem. No. He then spent like 6 months chiseling it away and getting it just right. And maybe he said, first of all, they screw you up, your mum and dad.
Yeah.
I'm across your life as a poet, you're going to write in different ways at different times. And I don't regret how I wrote when I was 21 or 25 or 31. And I hope I won't regret how I write when I'm 61 in a couple of years' time. But I do want it to be different. I do want to have changed, developed. And I think form is attracted to me now because it stops me writing in a way, it slows me down, it creates a challenge to create excitement. Whereas when I was young, I think just writing anything was exciting because it was so new. Now I've written, I've not published very many poems, maybe a couple of hundred, but I've written hundreds of poems. So the writing of a poem is not so exciting as it was when you're 21 and you suddenly think, oh my God, a poem's appeared.
And we came back again to the power of poetry to be memorised, or at least to be memorable.
Let me not to the marriage true minds in the impediment, love is not love, but alters when alteration finds. That is still a beautiful couple of lines. And that whole poem is of great use in so many ways, but also just the pleasure of seeing how that Midlands writer, William Shakespeare, how he, blessed by the blue skies of the Midlands, the lovely vales of our area, how he managed to create something which was so finely engineered that it is not a syllable can be altered.
Yeah.
And that engineering, you don't have to look at it when you're reading a poem or even writing it, But he knew when he was writing it, he knew how to bolt together a good poem, I think.
You can have Shakespeare, yes.
Thank you.
That's a Midlands, that's a definite goal for the West Midlands, definitely. Wow. Anyway, we ought to have
a second
poem number 2, which I very much hope is by Jonathan Davidson.
It is. And it's a poem I wrote, tells me here, I wrote it the latest version was 20th of October 2021, so it's 2 years old, 1.5 years old. It's got some of the things I talked about in it, family and looking back, a certain ruefulness, a certain melancholia. I like that stuff. That's what I like. I'll just explain, most people will know that a dipper is a little bird that lives in fast-flowing upland streams, not in the Midlands, unfortunately. There are dippers in the Midlands, but by and large, it's not a bird you find here much. And it's about my late father. Shall I just read it? First time I've ever read this read it aloud, actually. I might have read it aloud at home once, but really, I've never, I hardly do any readings. I don't, I try to. The idea is I restrict the access to my work to increase demand, and that's why I'm so incredibly rich, Joe.
Yes, that's what it is.
Dapper as a dipper. Dapper as a dipper, my father could be when he wanted to. Took to the dance floor in patent leather pumps. So easily, he led my mum upstream and down before taking whatever applause he could find and flitting off into the shallows. Not so much elusive as unwilling to mind what anyone said, so long as he got seen for what he was. More than just a man riding his bike to work across a slow river and over pale hills, who began each dull day with reading a book on the low call of the speech radio, farming today, sending him, solitary bird, on his way.
That's beautiful, thank you.
It's hard work, that poem. Hard work. It is, because it's a sonnet, and I was trying to disguise it being a sonnet, as you suggested. So, you don't want the rhymes to come clunking, but you want them to be there to hold the piece together cerebrally, and when somebody hears it. So that was a lot of versions of that. I mean, that's obviously, to remind myself about some aspects of my father and my mother, to contrast his elegance on the dance floor, which used to embarrass my sister and I immensely when we were children. And to contrast that with the fact that he was a factory worker and he cycled to work very early every day, and he wasn't at all, in that guise, considered of any value or importance. He was a nobody. But when he was on the dance floor, he was that little bird flitting up and down, feeling good. And my dad was a good dancer. He was a good dancer. He could move. Davidson's could move. Fred's a great dancer as well. And when I've had a glass of ginger beer shandies, I like to cut a rug.
Yes.
We love dancing. Davidsons do, and my dad did, and it was for those he learned dancing in the 40s and 50s as a young working class man in Liverpool, and it's what young working class people did, was to give themselves a sense of something beyond the everyday. And that isn't about manning the barricades. That's not about changing everybody's opinion. It's definitely a different thing from what Shelley was doing when he was writing Mask of Anarchy. But for me personally, for my own self, to be able to remember my personal life. One of the reasons to write poetry, of course, is to remember these experiences I've been through, my parents, their history, my children, all that kind of stuff. It is a common experience. Everybody says goodbye to their parents. Everybody has memories of their parents and mixed feelings about them, of course, as Larkin evidenced. God, we're lucky, aren't we, as poets, in that we can do things that will last forever, but do not kill us to make them happen, are cheap, relatively easy to do, and will give something that might be of value to other people in the future. Even if it's only 2 or 3 people, that doesn't matter. My kids might find this of value.
The trick is to tell your experience, but to allow room for the reader's experience to populate and inhabit that poem as well.
And poets need to be better at language than other people. Otherwise, they don't need to read our poems, they can write their own. They can write their own, but I want to write things where they say, wow, I can see what you're saying here. I'm going to carry this poem as a memory of my father, because I won't ever write that image of my father as a
Yeah.
dipper, but you've given me that.
Yeah.
Let's get to the third poem.
Third poem.
This is also short, and this is also sort of tightly formed. And this poem, and I'm going to give some notes about it, a few notes, because why should I not? It's not unseen comprehension. So I can say I have a recovered memory as an adult of when I first, as a child, experienced a sense of loss and knowing that something had ended. And I must have been about 10, and I had a friend, a boy, and we hung out together. I remember him coming around my house for tea, which was quite unusual. My house, I didn't invite people back very much, or it didn't happen. And he was the son of somebody in the army, of an army camp where I lived, in an army base. So these kids get transferred, their fathers got transferred, and so suddenly he went. And I have this recovered memory of feeling, when I was 10, that loss, that sense of he's gone and I'm never going to see him again. Looking back, it's a little bit about male love. I'm heterosexual, but I'm attracted to men. I'm attracted to women, but I'm attracted to men because certainly my early friendships were with men, young men, boys my age. And so I realised this is I'm retrieving that memory of that very innocent and sweet friendship I had with this other boy, and hopefully he with I, and the fact that we were separated and no one ever explained or made any effort to cover that. Listeners should imagine that we start with silence, and into that silence a small number of words are placed. But the silence is where the thinking happens, and the silence is where, in my case, the hurting happens. 2 boys. Forgot the boy I once adored, aged 10, an army family his, so very suddenly gone. That first forgetting did not hurt at all. I once, then never, spoke of him, so no harm done. I saw him in my head 5 days ago, a wet, cold spring, and yet improbably the sun shone on his blonde hair, on my tanned limbs, as we dangled from the swing, as it swung, dangerous fun for an afternoon. But afterwards is as empty as the park was when we'd gone. 2 boys, then none. God, I can feel my sadness, that feeling that we would never swing on those swings again. But yeah, so, and when I wrote that poem, I wanted to write a poem that sounded like poetry in the old-fashioned sense, but that wasn't demotic conversation. Every expletive syllable and sound has been hammered away to make that poem again and again and again. And because it's rhymed, of course, you screw yourself up with it when you go in one direction. You think, no, it's not going to work. I'm going to have to go back again and see what I get. And I remember writing again and again and again and again, such a short poem, literally dozens of times. And so eventually I think I'm getting to as close as I can get. Now, it may be too artificial for some people's taste because it has this rhyme scheme, because I'm dramatic when I read it. You saw me. I felt like I needed to conduct myself.
Yes.
Because this is a score for me, and I am playing that score using my body as the instrument, and the silence has got to be paced out. You've got to know how long the silence is.
It reminds me of that quote from Don Patterson, which I think I've never understood until this moment, where he says a poem is a little machine for remembering itself.
That is an excellent quote. When I was early involved in poetry, I was in a poetry group in Leicester when I was at Leicester Polytechnic. Worker Education Association ran it. A woman called Catherine Barron, a very good poet, ran it. And she used to talk about, you could throw rocks off it. You could bounce rocks off it, meaning that the poem was so good that every single thing was locked in place and nothing could be dislodged. It was just absolutely had to be like that. I've always thought that was a lovely image of what we're trying to produce. We're trying to apply pressure to this molten language. So we want to metamorphise the language by applying the pressure of our craft on it. And eventually it will fuse into the thing that it is meant to be, which might be a diamond or it might be a lump of coal. But,
Until 150 years ago, say, most people couldn't write. You might be able to read because they're very different skills. Most of the poetry that we have had through human history has been written down only to be spoken and to be shared vocally, and for its chimes and its sounds to be played out in that way.
Yeah, we get the poetry of the form we choose to place it on. So, once printing comes along and books, then yes, poems get longer because you don't have to memorise them anymore because you've got the book. But of course, the book limits the poem only to those people who can read the stuff, unless somebody else reads it out. Of course, lots of books are printed to be read out, and a book would happen and one person would be reading it aloud and another 5 people would be listening, and the book would have a different kind of life for those people who are just hearing it. If the printing press, if Gutenberg had not invented a printing press, but instead had invented the dictaphone or whatever, we'd have a different literary culture entirely. Instead, he invented the movable press, and the rest is history. We have a very easy to engage with art form. The barriers to entry are speech. If you've got speech, even if you've got speech through sign language, if you've got communication, you can engage in this art form. You don't need anything else. You don't even need to write it down. You can just memorise it and then speak it aloud. You can memorise poems and take them with you when you're driving, doing the washing up. It's such a frustration to people who wish to buy and sell, because art is a commodity that however many people consume it, its value does not in any way diminish, unlike the classic pork pie, which I understand to my cost. Once somebody else has had a slice, there is one slice left. So what an art form where as many people as possible can consume it. The same is true of visual arts. In some ways, the same is not true of those arts which are time-based. So once the piece of music is played, if you weren't there to hear it, you've missed it.
Yes.
But with the poem, of course, it's very easy to replay it. It takes a moment to do that, and it doesn't involve a highly accomplished assemblage of people to do it.
The recording of music, which was not available until about 100 years ago, must have completely transformed how people consumed music, that they can listen to it again.
And of course they stopped playing it. We're lucky with poetry that people have not stopped writing poems just because there are many other poems out there. They've still kept on writing their own, but what they have stopped doing is speaking them aloud, and they've certainly stopped memorising them. A memorable poem is not just a useful thing for people who are too cheap to buy the book, but the quality of memorability will ensure that the poem has a certain quality about itself as a whole. To make it memorable means you've got to really drill down into what it really means and get rid of that which is unnecessary. And that poem I just read, I wrote that because I want to make it memorable. I want it to have a form. But if somebody wanted to memorise it, they could do it. And actually, when you look at it on the page, you can already see the pattern. You can hear the pattern.
Because there is pattern, yes.
And it has clear images, as you referenced earlier on, which is that wonderful chapter in Ted Hughes' book, By Heart, when he talks about the method to remember poetry. And he said just what you said. Did he get that from you? I suspect he did. Ted Hughes was a scout.
A poem which survives for year upon year upon year survives precisely because it can wear many people's clothes. That makes sense.
Well, that's a great way of testing the value of a poem. If you hand it over to somebody else to read and they still manage to make it work, then maybe you've got something there. In the poem are the instructions for how it might be delivered. So that Shakespeare sonnet I started with some while ago, towards the end, it's got a line which is clustered with consonants. What Shakespeare is saying is, you must read this slowly.
Yes.
You must read it slowly. Here are my notes to you, the actor, how to do it. I'm directing you. Follow those notes and you will do it beautifully. Try and read it like it's an instruction book for a washing machine, and you won't get the best from it. Possibly poetry should have some kind of notation on it, just as music does, to at least give you a sense that this is in a certain key, or that this is presto or largo or whatever. So you don't head off in the wrong direction because you've never read it before. One of the other things we damage ourselves in poetry by doing is we only read them once. What musician would only play a piece of music once and say, I don't like it, or I can't do it? No, they'd have another go. And eventually, I see what's going on here. Right, okay, here we go. I'll do it again. Right, you got it right. Poetry, we think, it's words, it's so easy. We don't need to read it twice. Yes, I'm afraid you do.
For listeners who are members of the Poetic License, I'm always trying to give them useful tips. And the qualities of sound in your poem are so important that when you're at that stage of drafting and redrafting, if you read it aloud, don't imagine yourself reading it aloud, read the damn thing aloud. And if you can bear it, get someone else to read it aloud, and you will immediately hear the clangers that you've been looking for, and you think, oh, that's where the syllable is, that's where the rhyme fails, that's where the rhythm or the pace.
But also the opposite can happen. Somebody else can read your poem and you think, my God, that's not bad, is it? I like that.
Yeah.
And it's it's an honour to have somebody else spend some time working on your poem and working out how to best release it. And in fact, there's that line, I think, from Hamlet where he's addressing the actors to tell them not to soar the sky with their arm, but to just say the words as they speak the words that they're spoken, or something as they're written. I can't remember that phrase, but what Shakespeare was saying was, I've written you some damn good writing here.
Yeah.
You don't need to stop tap dancing halfway through. And the small dog, you can put that down now because we don't need the small dog in this speech. Just say the bloody words so I can hear them because they're beautiful. And as long as you say them clearly, we'll be okay. We should develop our views on poetry through discourse, for having somebody like you to discuss and offer different arguments. And one of the things I finish by saying, I say to many people I work with in poetry, I say, you should engage in some correspondence with other people. You should write to them to say what you think about the poets, how I like your poems or whatever, or ask them a question. But that means you're part of a poetry community, exchanging views and developing. And that is a thing that, you and I know happened in the 16th and 17th and 18th century. That was how culture was developed, with people slowly writing letters to each other or meeting in coffee houses and speaking about the issue. I would love to have more of that, not people telling each other what they should think, but people just sharing their views. So you can, because that's how I arrived at my views, is, talking to other people and listening to what they've got to say.
I hope you've enjoyed these insights into Jonathan's creative process and his thinking about the sound and the shape and the form of poetry. As we drew to the end of our interview, he relaxed a bit and he just uttered a few little phrases that reminded me why I admire the man, value his friendship, and love his poetry so very much.
It's a great privilege to be closely involved with an art form, to be walking out with it, to be in love with it, and to carry on discovering why you love it. Yeah, God, we're lucky. Such riches available to us. 1,000 years of poetry is available to us in English, never mind stuff in translation. Yeah, I pity the rest.